مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. كما يعلم الجميع، أميركا هي بلد فيه انقسام عميق. نحن على هذه الحال منذ أكثر من 20 عاما، ولازلنا في المكان نفسه اليوم، مع شبه تعادل بين الحزبين في مجلس الشيوخ ومجلس النواب، مثلما كنا في عام 2000 عندما فاز جورج بوش بالرئاسة بهامش ضيق بلغ 537 صوتا في ولاية فلوريدا. لسنا منقسمين في العمق فقط، بل نحن منقسمون بالتساوي أيضا. نعلم أن الانقسام ينطبق على السياسة المحلية، ولكن هل ينطبق على السياسة الخارجية أيضا؟ هل نحن منقسمون بهذا العمق حيال الحرب والسلام والأمن، كما نحن منقسمين حيال الرعاية الصحية والإجهاد والهجرة؟ لمناقشة رأي الأميركيين حيال السياسة الخارجية والأمن القومي، وكيف تؤثر هذه الآراء في السياسة، يسرني أن أستضيف المراقبين الخبيرين بتأثير أمريكا على أنحاء العالم، دينيس روس ومارك هانا. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Americans are famously divided on a broad array of political and social issues. Does this deep division extend to foreign policy as well? Well, there was a time when politics stopped at the water's edge, with there being a general consensus on foreign policy. Does it still last? We're going to talk about these issues with our two guests, Dennis Ross and Mark Hanna. Thank you very, very much to both of you for joining us today. Dennis, when you first came to Washington, what was your experience? Was there bipartisanship in foreign policy, or was it more like today's antagonism?
You know, I don't know that you could ever say that politics completely stopped at the water's edge, but you could surely say that there was a sense of responsibility across the aisle, that on foreign policy issues, there was a need to find commonality. When I first started, I actually started as a long time ago, as an intern. And I actually worked for a Republican from San Francisco. And his relationship with the Democrats and, in a sense, with people in the Senate on both sides of the aisle was extremely strong. And you had this sense that when it came to foreign policy, there were a number of issues on which there was a fundamental consensus. In some ways, that was easier because everything was sort of oriented against the Soviet Union. You could still have divisions and debate, but there was something that was a kind of organizing principle here. Later on, when I was, played a senior role and was our ambassador, our negotiator in the Middle East, I would spend a lot of time on the Hill. I never had a difficulty working with what was a pretty broad array of centrists, Republicans and Democrats alike. So it really is a different world today than it was then.
Of course, just mentioning the fact that there was a Republican from San Francisco dates you a bit, Dennis.
I think it's fair to say that.
So, drawing on an annual survey from the Eurasia Group Foundation, let's take a look at where we are today. Mark, today, more consensus, more bipartisanship, or more division, in your view?
Well, it depends on who you're asking. If you go out to the American public, there's a surprising amount of agreement in this moment of, otherwise sharp political polarization around how America should approach the world. So, this idea that politics stops at the water's edge, that was kind of a product of the geopolitical realities at the dawn of the Cold War when Senator Vandenberg used that expression. But right now we're also at this sort of dawn of a new era where we're kind of searching for what America's appropriate role is in this kind of post-unipolar moment. And the United States, we ask and think it's important to ask the general public what their preferences are for America's role in the world. And we were surprised to learn, whether you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, you have a lot of appetite for negotiating, for example, with America's adversaries. When the Biden administration confronts Russia over its war in Ukraine, and asked what the most important goal is for the United States, whether you're a Democrat, Republican, or independent, the main thing you want to see is the avoidance of escalation with a nuclear-armed Russia. So there were a lot of questions on which Democrats and Republicans actually agree when it comes to foreign policy. The bigger divide happens, we've seen, generationally, intergenerationally. So younger Americans whose only experience of American foreign policy has been these kind of inconclusive and unsuccessful wars in the Middle East, do not subscribe to American exceptionalism, are more reluctant to commit American military forces around the world than their older counterparts. So that was particularly interesting. And there's also a divide, and we can get into that a little bit later, between the foreign policy establishment as such in Washington, people who are making these kind of policy decisions in the name of and on behalf of Americans and the general public. So that's a big part of why we do this survey, is to kind of try to get the American public to be more attentive to these decisions, as well as getting foreign policymakers more sensitive to public sentiment.
So, Dennis, you're very plugged into the Washington policymaking world. From your perspective and the perspective of your professional colleagues, what do you think? How do you see the most serious threats facing America? And then, Mark, I want you then to tell us how most Americans see the most serious threats facing our country. Dennis?
Yeah, I think there is a kind of general consensus in the foreign policy professional community, and I would say largely consistent with where the Biden administration is as well. Number one would be the threat that the Russia war in Ukraine is posing, the genuine risk of escalation. We've now seen 2 missiles fired into Poland, seemingly to cross the threshold, whether by design or not. The idea that nuclear weapons themselves could be talked about in a way that makes their use thinkable the more you talk about it. So I think that's number one. Number two, and it's more of a near-term thing, although 9 months into this war, it begins to look as if it's not something that's going to go away quickly. China is clearly seen as, again, a kind of consensus bipartisan issue, long-term strategic challenge. These two, I think, are overriding. I would say Iran is a third issue in terms of, again, potential threats, concern about the nuclear issue, concern about what it's doing in the region. I think those would be, from a geopolitical standpoint, those would be the overriding issues that are seen. Then there are issues like climate change, which do affect national security, and which I think there's less of a consensus on both climate change as an issue and obviously what to do about it. I think the broader threats of cyber that one sees, this too is a major national security issue. I think there's less of a division on that, but I think it's also a very prominent concern that will actually become of greater concern as time goes by. Clearly, you have the actors who you view as a threat as using this as a new tool. The Russians obviously use it a lot. We've seen the Iranians very active with it. The same with China. You'll recall that it was the Chinese who basically hacked all of OPM's files. So I think these are
Office of Personnel Management in the government.
Right. These are, I'd say these are sort of the prime threats. There may be lesser ones that we could go through, but I think these are the major ones that I think preoccupy the foreign policy professionals.
And Mark, when you look at what average Americans say is their top national security concerns, how do they mesh with what Dennis just outlined?
Yeah, they don't typically mesh that much. And one of the benefits of doing this survey, there are other wonderful organizations like the Chicago Council who do surveys, and so I'm in dialogue with a lot of my fellow lead authors on their surveys, and We didn't at the Eurasia Group Foundation ask about, top security threat, but Chicago Council did. And it was interesting that some of the things that they found and have a lot more to do with nuclear weapons. We did ask a question on nuclear weapons, and 3/4 of our survey respondents are very concerned about the use of nuclear weapons. But it's interesting that in the Chicago Council survey, the sort of erosion of democracy around the world, which is a big sort of rallying cry for the Biden administration as it seeks to defend Ukraine, isn't resonating with the general public. They don't see the erosion of democracy as a threat to the United States or its interests or values necessarily in the world. So I thought that was particularly interesting. And this isn't a topic on which there is some partisan disagreement. We ask about one of the sort of threats to peace, which is a sort of a roundabout way of getting at what you're asking. And to a large extent, Republicans cite immigration as an issue, and Democrats do cite the erosion of democracy here at home, and the need to revitalize institutions and democratic sort of practices here in the United States. Seeing, for example, January 6th potentially had an impact on these numbers. So that was interesting to us. But yeah, there isn't sort of a large alignment between the public and policymakers on what the threats out there are. And part of that is probably a product of the fact that, people in the professional policymaking community do this for a living, have deep expertise, and understand, are paid to be attentive and alert to these threats in the way that ordinary Americans just aren't doing on a day-to-day basis.
All right, when we come back after the break, I want to explore the question of how deeply seated isolationism or reluctance to engage is in our body politic, and whether the millions of tentacles that connect us around the world are overcoming this natural tendency. In just a moment. Again, my guests today include Mark Hanna. Mark is a senior fellow with the Eurasia Group Foundation based in New York City. He is lead author of a fascinating new survey on what Americans think about foreign policy. He worked on both the Obama and Kerry campaigns for the White House. Also joining us is Ambassador Dennis Ross. Dennis is my colleague and counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Dennis has 25 years of bipartisan experience at high levels of government, including White House tours in the Obama, Clinton, Bush, and Reagan administrations, and service as the president's special envoy for Middle East peace. So let's take one issue that comes up in the survey that you looked at, Mark, and that's willingness to fight, what Americans are willing to fight for. A generation ago, George W. Bush sent 500,000 Americans to the Gulf to evict Saddam from Kuwait. A generation later, today, there is no talk of sending one American to evict Putin from Ukraine. What Americans think about sending troops abroad, and why has there been such an evolution on this issue over the years? Mark, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I think, again, the wars that we fought in the intervening period in Iraq and Afghanistan have informed American opinion. The fact that, Putin owns more nuclear weapons than any other country or any other leader in the world probably might be shading these perspectives. But Americans are broadly sympathetic toward Ukraine. And our survey results show that there was actually an uptick by 27% in the number of Americans who we would classify as Wilsonian, who sort of think that the U.S. has both a moral obligation and an important national interest in spreading American values throughout the world. So I think that was probably prompted by the news coverage of the war in Ukraine. So that I don't think that this kind of tendency for the public to be more restrained in its desire for military use than people inside the Beltway is necessarily universal, but it is there, and it's worth exploring. I wouldn't call Americans isolationist. Part of the reason we do this survey is other surveys will ask about, what do you want America to be engaged in the world? And that might have made sense 70 years ago or 50 years ago, but right now in an era of globalization, it's not as though the United States is going to start cutting back all its trade and engage in economic protectionism and not be a nation of immigrants. So we do focus really on national security issues. And there is a strong desire, I think, to focus on the sort of problems and the threats and the rot and the erosion to democratic norms here at home, and to focus energy there. And that's sort of a bipartisan phenomenon among the public. So I think either that sort of needs to be heeded more by policymakers in Washington, or policymakers in Washington just need to do a better job of explaining the rationale for, this is why we need to continue to arm Ukraine, or we need to send these weapon systems over there, because otherwise, you have certain voices in Washington, and we've seen this emerge in the past couple of weeks, who start to employ the politics of opposition and division. And if that case isn't made well enough, there's a vulnerability to that kind of support. If Americans don't understand what is America's goal in Ukraine, why do we align with these people? Not just because they're a democracy, but because we're trying to preempt or preclude or stop the possibility of this being the new normal again, but sort of power politics in Europe. Then we need to get back to that. So that's hopefully a wake-up call for the people that read this report.
So, Dennis, I know you're writing a book that looks at different streams of American foreign policy. Does it make sense to you that there's this upsurge of Wilsonianism at the expense, I assume, of what one would call Jacksonian approach that we had more under the American First era of Donald Trump?
Look, it's a really interesting distinction. And I think Mark made a couple of points that I think really are salient here. One, it's not a surprise that there might be more of an impulse to not assume responsibilities for others after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that really gets to the heart of your question, Rob. We had no role internationally where we assumed responsibilities for others until after World War II. Even Wilson wasn't so much assuming commitments to others as he was trying to create collective security as a broader responsibility. And it was in the service of making the world safe for democracy, promoting his 14 points, self-determination and the like, reflecting a broader sense of moral responsibility on the world stage. That sense is something that if you look at our Wilsonians after World War II, George W. Bush is sort of the embodiment, more than anybody else, more than Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan might talk about, we're the city on the hill, quoting John Winthrop, but he really wasn't huge on our exporting those values. Barack Obama spoke of the values, but he really wanted us to be an example as opposed to someone who would actively export. So I think what we see now with Ukraine looks like such a case of good versus evil. I mean, it's unmistakable. What does Putin do? He tries to basically eradicate a separate Ukrainian state. It's a case of overt aggression. So you can see we should be on the side of defending that. I'm not surprised that kind of an overt attack and that overt aggression, that if you don't answer it, it means any country that is stronger can take advantage of a weaker country. Any border is subject to being changed through the use of force. So there's basically norms you want to preserve. And I think it, again, gets to what I would describe as the common sense of the American public.
Right. Terrific. Well, thank you both. This is a fascinating and nuanced conversation about the relationship between public opinion and the making of American foreign policy and how that has evolved and will continue to change. Mark Hanna, Dennis Ross, thank you very much for joining me on Dakhel Washington. It's one of the oldest debates in political theory. Do citizens elect representatives to reflect their specific views, wishes, and desires, Or do they elect representatives who they believe will use their own wisdom, insight, and experience to make decisions they believe are in the public interest? In other words, do we want our representatives to have polls determine their vote? Or do we want our representatives to rely on their independent judgment for how they should vote? Of course, this is an academic exercise. In the real world, senators and congressmen do both, balancing their direct connection with voters with their own instincts, beliefs, and ideas. Otherwise, for example, we would have no taxes. The real question is how the balance works out. Are there certain issues where the balance tilts in one direction or the other? Foreign policy may be one of those issues for which we should be grateful that our representatives often use their own common sense and good judgment, not mechanically voting just the way poll numbers suggest. Left to their own devices, we tend isolationist. Americans are reluctant to get involved in other countries' problems, reluctant to intervene in other countries' disputes, reluctant to send U.S. funds to fix other countries' maladies, and especially reluctant to dispatch Americans in uniform to fight other countries' battles. This reluctance to get involved in foreign disputes is rooted in our American DNA. It harkens back to George Washington's farewell address, in which he warned against permanent alliances and foreign entanglements. It is what led the Senate to reject the League of Nations after World War I, to close the gates to immigration in the 1920s, and to wait 2.5 years after Hitler invaded Poland to join the global conflict on the side of democracy, waiting until Japan attacked Pearl Harbor before we could overcome our national reluctance to get involved. Decades later, decades in which America's phenomenal growth was fueled by our post-World War II global leadership, polls show Americans still remain deeply reluctant to get involved in the world, that most voters oppose American military deployments, oppose foreign assistance, and oppose many defense alliances. Perhaps that's because advocates of these ideas have done a poor job explaining themselves, with polls after polls showing that Americans think we spend many times the actual amount in foreign assistance, for example. Or perhaps it's just because of the sense of security two oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, provide. A false sense of security, I may add. Our two oceans did not stop 9/11, and they won't stop cyber attacks, ballistic missiles, or the spread of deadly pandemics. The reality is that America is deeply connected to the broader world through travel and tourism, through culture and commerce, so deeply connected that it is folly to think we can build walls high enough and thick enough to protect ourselves. So instead, we act abroad to protect what matters, our ideas, our allies, our interests. It's what created the world in which we thrive, a world of NATO and the World Bank, a world of UNICEF and blue helmets. It wouldn't happen without senators and congressmen who use their brains, not just read opinion polls. It's what our form of democracy is all about. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كان لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول البرنامج وبالأخص بشأن دار الرأي العام في السياسة الخارجية، تواصلوا معي رجاء عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو تراسلوني مباشرة على الرابط @RobSatloff. إلى اللقاء في الأسبوع القادم، حتى ذلك الحين إلى اللقاء.